Hi, this is Paul McGuire, and we're dealing with part 2 of this series of a prophetic emergency alert, in which in the previous message, part 1, I outlined the reality that mankind and people in America and every nation on planet Earth, that we are rapidly approaching what scientists call a mass extinction level event. And I used an analogy, if you will, an analogy of astronauts who left planet Earth, let's say 100 years ago approximately. They left planet Earth because planet Earth was beginning to disintegrate and implode. And they successfully colonized Mars, created a new human civilization, had children and grandchildren. And then they decided, the grandchildren decided on the basis of the videos and the pictures that they saw of planet Earth, they decided to return via manned spaceships powered by a futuristic energy source. But as they began to enter, while they were still far out in space, and they had not yet entered the outer atmosphere, and they had not yet passed through or come close to the Van Allen belt, they began to experience extreme turbulence. And as they looked carefully through the windows of their spacecraft, they began to notice that planet Earth was no longer the blue planet with vast oceans and greenery that they remembered from the pictures they saw as a child. That something catastrophic had happened to planet Earth since the time their parents left. And then I use that simply as an analogy. I use that simply as a storytelling advice. I use that as a literary device, if you will, to set the stage for the essential question I'm asking. And the essential question is this: when we as human beings, in whatever nation we live in, when we see grave danger which will destroy us, do we, as human beings created in the image of God, do we employ the resources that God has given us, since we were created in His own image? Do we employ the resources that He's embedded in our DNA to proactively react before it all detonates? Do we step forward and resist both the human tendency to be paralyzed with fear and do nothing, and do we also simultaneously resist the spiritual fear, which would embrace a false, non-biblical theology, but still has the net effect of producing a fear that paralyzes us from taking the necessary action based on using the necessary God-given intelligence to change the potentiality of the crisis event? In other words, once we, using the wisdom that God has given us, identify precisely what it is that is going to bring about crisis or a mass extinction level event, we're confronted with one of two choices. We can surrender to the paralysis of fear, which immobilizes us. We can surrender to a false and non-biblical theology that is a thinking system that is not only non-biblical, but it's a thinking system that is actually promoted as a virtue. And I'm not trying to disparage other religions, but there's many Hindu and Buddhist and Eastern mystical religions, as well as other religions, that promote a non-biblical fatalism. So that when people whose consciousness has been shaped by the non-biblical concept of fatalism, and by the way, there's millions of Christians who have falsely embraced a fatalistic view of their lives and a fatalistic view of reality that has nothing to do with the Bible, just like there are millions and billions of people who embrace certain Hinduistic, Buddhist, Eastern mystical philosophies that also embrace fatalism. And let me define fatalism. Fatalism is the false concept that ultimately we are not made in the image of God, and we were not created by the Creator, capital C, and because we emerge through some kind of mystical, random, accidental evolutionary process that spanned over 1 billion years, our lives have no meaning and our lives have no purpose, and we essentially have no identity. In other words, we have no identity beyond that of an amoeba or a protoplasm or bacteria. Do you understand what I'm saying? If you embrace fatalism, you simultaneously make the mistake in fatalism and random chance and evolutionary accident are kissing cousins. Okay, they're co-travelers together. And if you embrace fatalism, you simultaneously, whether you're conscious of it or not, you embrace evolutionary random chance, which suggests, without sufficient scientific evidence, that the reality of every one of our existence and the reality of every individual's identity, and thus their infinite meaning and purpose, is all accidental. It all happened by random chance. That is a co-traveler with fatalism, because both of those false viewpoints of reality, what they do to the individual is this. Let me explain it in the simplest terms. I'm sitting in this chair, okay? And from this chair, I have a choice. I can look at the studio. I can look at the people in the back of the studio, and I can choose to believe the reality that I see with my senses, my eyes, visual reality, my ears, auditory reality, my senses, like my senses from my fingers, my tactile senses, and so on and so forth. So I see a reality that's very real, and the reason I know that this reality is real is because I have a set of sensory perceptions, or perceptions that are based on, let's call it a human biocomputer feedback mechanism of sight, sound, hearing, so on and so forth. And therefore, I see reality based on what my senses are inputting into my mind. And that is reality. It's real. The people are real. I could talk to them. Now, I could put my hands over my eyes and make believe that my physical sense reality is not real, and I could get very creative with my imagination. I could turn the lights out. I could do what a lot of people in California and Colorado are doing right now and hallucinate. I could sit in the dark, listen to music, and literally hallucinate an artificial reality that is not real. It's produced out of the fantasy of my mind, and it's not my senses that are producing this reality. It's my imagination triggered by psychedelic mind-altering substances, which allows my imagination to create a completely virtual world based on fantasy, but it's not reality. And if I acted on it, I could pay serious consequences, like people who have taken LSD, decades ago, and they thought they could fly, and they walked off the top of skyscrapers in Manhattan and died because they were hallucinating the false construct that they could fly, and that the law of gravity had no command over them. You see, that's the danger of hallucinating or projecting or imagining a completely false virtual reality. And then finally, I have my senses, which can construct a reality. But there's a third option. The third option is I can surrender my God-given mental faculties and perception. And I'm talking about that which was given to me by the DNA of God, such as the gift of perception, the gift of critical thinking, the gift of reasoning, the gift of logic, the gift of rationalism, the gift of creativity, the gift of being able to assemble complexities or connect the dots, if you will, into a coherent pattern. Those are all God-given intelligence, perception-based gifts. Now, here's where the third element enters. Let's say, hypothetically, that in addition to the physical reality and the virtual realities I just described, there exists an unknown or invisible player that I have never been told about in school, college, preschool, high school, or whatever. I've never been told about this invisible player. Therefore, I'm completely unaware, based on my education, that an invisible player exists. I've never been told about this invisible player through the cable news network news or mainstream media news. I've never been told about this invisible player through all the educational years I went through. No cultural heroes explained the invisible player to me. And so, based on what I call the mind control factories of education, which I believe actually dumb people down rather than raise their perception, it lowers their perception, it anesthetizes their critical thinking ability. The truth has been very carefully stolen and hidden from me, that there exists an invisible player. And this invisible player is either an individual, an entity, a small handful of individuals, or this invisible player is an AI, artificial intelligence, a robot, a cyborg, or whatever. To any degree, it's an invisible player, because it functions as if it was a human, and it has the power to modify and alter reality. And it has the power to not only alter and modify reality, it has the power and the creativity to distort the reality that you're perceiving, and it has the power to reconfigure that reality for the subversive purpose of creating a virtual reality for you, which seduces you into thinking that kind of like you're in heaven, but you're not, and you're disarmed. You've dropped your guard, because what this invisible player has done is that he or she or it has managed to enter what we call reality and reconfigure it for the express purpose of takeover, control, and conquest of human beings. In other words, this invisible player, who is unseen, has come for the purpose of subjugating mankind and making mankind, men and women, its slaves, by conquering the minds of men and women, conquering their perception, conquering their reasoning, and reducing their ability to connect the dots. This invisible player is not altruistic. This invisible player is totally about the enslavement of the masses, to transform the masses without them knowing it, to serve the invisible players as slaves. And the programming is so exquisite and so perfected that the invisible player or players are able to enslave mankind, and then mankind then functions in relationship to the invisible player as slaves. Mankind serves the invisible players as slaves, but they are completely without any consciousness or clue that they have been conquered and transformed into slaves. In fact, they have no concept whatsoever. They have no realization whatsoever. They have no awareness whatsoever that they have been programmed to be slaves. And finally, as Aldous Huxley said, the programming can be done so perfectly that they can be programmed to actually love their servitude, love their slavery, and love to do their duties as slaves. And so on one level, you have a very evil and corrupt but harmonious relationship. And that evil and corrupt harmonious relationship is one that the slave population, we as human beings who have been enslaved and conquered by having our perception and our intellect conquered, have no idea that we're slaves. And so we think, because we've been programmed, we think that we're free, and we have been programmed to learn to love our duties as slaves. We've learned to love our servitude. This is what I call the Pharaoh God-King system that existed in ancient Egypt. It's the system that existed in ancient Babylon at the Tower of Babel, and this system still exists today as the world's globalist elite, through organizations like the Illuminati and others, create what is called, Brzezinski, one of the co-founders of the Trilateral Commission, a partner with Rockefeller, created the term the technocratic elite, in which a technological and scientific elite would enslave the masses using psychotronic weapons. Now, if you ask the average person what a psychotronic weapon is, they'd have no idea. Yet, they're being enslaved by psychotronic weapons. And Brzezinski wrote this book in 1976. It was called Between Two Ages. And he advocated the use of psychotronic weapons on the population and the implementation of a technocratic elite or a technocratic dictatorship. So what does the word technocratic elite or technocratic dictatorship mean? Because when you break down the meaning of the term, you break the chains of your slavery. Techne comes from the word technological. So it's a technological elite. Techne comes from the word Wicca, which comes from the word witchcraft. So the actual word definition of technocratic elite comes from techne, from which we get technology or science, and then witchcraft or Wicca. And then the root word of Wicca or witchcraft is the reconfiguration of reality. So when Brzezinski or Huxley tell us that we're being ruled by a technocratic elite, what they're really saying is there exists an elite, an unseen player has entered the room, And they have reconfigured, they have transformed your reality internally and externally. They've completely transformed and reconfigured your reality according to their needs, and they have done it through a synergistic combination of highly advanced science, technology, and occult power, thus Wicca or witchcraft. So they have made one, like alchemical magic. They have made one, the occult, science, and technology, as the elite, and they use this occult, science, and technology to reconfigure our reality, the reality that you and I live in, for the purpose of transforming our identities into slaves. And we, in the words of Aldous Huxley, have been programmed to learn to love our slavery, take pleasure in our servitude, and we have no consciousness whatsoever. It's outside of the realm of our ability to perceive reality. We have no consciousness whatsoever that we are slaves. We don't realize that our core identity has been fundamentally perverted, that we now have the identity of slaves, learned helplessness. We contrast that with what Jesus Christ said when he said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And we discovered that in our original programming, when God the Creator, capital C, created the original man, Adam and Eve, he embedded in their DNA the supernatural authority and power and wisdom to rule and reign over planet Earth with the same stature as kings and queens, divine authority. So you see, the plan of the infinite personal living God of the universe was to set you free on every level and to empower you to proactively face challenges, such as the existential challenge facing spaceship Earth, and to proactively equip you to live on the highest level with the authority of the king or queen. That's why Jesus Christ said we are joint heirs with Jesus. Well, that means when we move into the dimension of eternity, we are joint heirs with the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Therefore, our inheritance, our royal nature, is infinite and without end. That's our end game. Now, contrast that with the programming that most people are unaware of the fact that they've even been programmed. Contrast that with the programming, the subconscious programming that most people have, including Christians who don't read their Bible. They have been programmed subconsciously to believe that their duty and purpose in life is to serve their elite masters as slaves. They have no consciousness that they are slaves, and they've been programmed to love their servitude and slavery. Now think of the two options. Think of the two options. But let's just circle back one more time, and the next question we're going to ask ourselves is this. We're on spaceship Earth. Our people 100 years ago went to Mars to escape the destruction of spaceship Earth, and their grandchildren have returned via spaceship to revisit the Earth, but they noticed that there's a paradigm shift. What I would like to do is use that analogy or literary device to show you how and why it's necessary, it's imperative that at this exact time in space, time, and history, that at this exact moment, because we live in an historical moment, it's essential for you and I to have the lights turned on in our consciousness and to fully understand that we are facing an existential threat that is unparalleled in human history. But at the same time, we have been given a power, a wisdom, and an embedding in our DNA that equips us to proactively and victoriously conquer rather than be conquered. I'm Paul McGuire. Visit paulmcguire.us. That's paulmcguire.us.
Thank you.